rituals, or visual imagery, because Aghora does not operate at the level where symbols and explanations normally function. It is not a philosophy meant to be debated, nor a belief system meant to be accepted or rejected. Aghora is a way of perceiving reality so directly that the usual psychological filters through which human beings experience the world begin to dissolve. To understand what Aghora really is, one must move away from curiosity and move toward attention, because Aghora does not reveal itself to interest, but to sustained awareness. At its core, Aghora is a state of non-division. It is rooted in the recognition that reality is not actually divided into pure and impure, sacred and profane, acceptable and unacceptable, even though human society depends on these divisions to function. The Aghoric perspective does not deny that society needs structure. Instead, it sees clearly that these structures are psychological agreements rather than absolute truths. Aghora begins when a person no longer mistakes these agreements for reality itself. This clarity is not intellectual. It does not arise from studying texts or adopting new concepts. It emerges when perception is no longer filtered through fear, preference, and avoidance. In Aghora, awareness is not selective. Nothing is excluded from attention. Whatever exists is allowed to be seen exactly as it is, without being categorized as spiritually useful or spiritually dangerous. This unconditional inclusion of reality is what gives Aghora its intensity. Aghora is, fundamentally, a discipline of radical honesty. Not honesty in the social sense of speaking truthfully to others, but honesty toward one's own perception. It is the refusal to distort experience in order to protect identity. Most people unconsciously edit reality so that their self-image, beliefs, and moral positions remain intact. Aghora removes this editing process. When perception is no longer edited, reality appears raw, undiluted, and often unsettling, not because it has changed, but because the mind no longer shields itself. This is why Aghora is often associated with extreme environments, such as cremation grounds. These places are not chosen for symbolism or shock value. They are chosen because they offer reality without decoration. In such environments, the temporary nature of the body, identity, and social status is not an idea, but a visible fact. Aghora does not contemplate impermanence. It remains present where impermanence is unavoidable. Through continuous exposure, the mind loses its ability to romanticize life or dramatize death. What remains is simple perception. In Aghora, awareness is not directed toward achieving peace, bliss, or transcendence. These are considered psychological outcomes, not truths. Awareness is valued for its own sake, not for what it produces. When awareness is sustained without expectation, the structures that maintain identity begin to weaken. This weakening is not forced. It happens naturally, because identity depends on repetition, memory, and anticipation, and sustained presence interrupts all three. The Aghoric approach does not seek purification, because purification implies rejection. To purify something, one must first label something else as impure. Aghora rejects this division entirely. From this perspective, everything that exists arises from the same source, and therefore cannot be fundamentally separate. This does not lead to moral chaos, as is often assumed. Instead, it leads to precision. Actions are no longer dictated by inherited rules, but arise from direct perception of consequences and reality. Aghora also involves a radical relationship with the body. The body is not treated as an obstacle to transcendence, nor as an object of worship. It is seen as a temporary process, subject to decay, sensation, and change. When the body is no longer used as the foundation of identity, fear loses one of its strongest anchors. Pain may still occur, but suffering, which requires psychological identification, begins to diminish. Death within Aghora is not treated as a spiritual event or a philosophical mystery. It is understood as a natural process that becomes terrifying only when identity is attached to continuity. As awareness deepens and identity loosens, death loses its psychological dominance. It is not denied, feared, or glorified. It is seen accurately, without emotional amplification. What makes Aghora so rare is not secrecy or restriction, but the absence of reward. There is no promise of becoming special, enlightened, or superior. Aghora offers no confirmation of progress. In fact, it steadily removes the very desire for confirmation. This makes it unattractive to most people, including spiritual seekers, because seeking itself depends on the belief that something more is needed. Aghora dismantles that belief at its root. So what Aghora really is can be stated simply but not lightly. Aghora is the state in which awareness remains present without exclusion, without interpretation, and without escape. It is the condition in which reality is met directly, without the psychological structures that normally soften, organize, or distort it. It is not light or darkness, purity or impurity, spirituality or transgression. It exists prior to all such categories. In this sense, Aghora is not something one practices in order to become something else. It is what remains when the impulse to become dissolves. It is not a path that leads forward, but a standing still so complete that movement itself loses meaning. And because it offers no comfort, no identity, and no conclusion, it remains one of the least understood and most demanding approaches to reality ever undertaken by a human being. This is what Aghora really is.
To understand what Aghora really is, it is necessary to understand how deeply the human mind depends on separation in order to feel secure. From childhood, perception is trained to divide reality into categories that feel manageable: right and wrong, clean and unclean, safe and unsafe, meaningful and meaningless. These divisions are not questioned because they provide stability. They allow the individual to function without constantly confronting uncertainty. Aghora begins precisely at the point where these divisions are no longer taken for granted. Aghora is the state of perception in which reality is encountered without these habitual filters. This does not mean that the Aghori rejects social norms or consciously opposes them. Rather, the Aghori no longer experiences these norms as absolute. They are seen as practical arrangements rather than truths. This shift may sound subtle, but it fundamentally alters how reality is experienced. When perception is no longer organized around preference and avoidance, awareness becomes continuous rather than selective. In ordinary life, attention constantly moves toward what is comforting and away from what is disturbing. This movement is so automatic that it is rarely noticed. Aghora interrupts this pattern. Awareness is trained to remain present regardless of what arises. Pleasant sensations are not clung to, and unpleasant sensations are not resisted. Over time, this absence of preference begins to dissolve the psychological structures that depend on reaction for their survival. This is why Aghora cannot be reduced to rituals, clothing, or external behavior. These are surface expressions that may or may not be present. What defines Aghora is the internal condition of awareness. An Aghori is not someone who performs certain acts, but someone in whom the division between observer and observed has weakened significantly. Reality is no longer experienced as something happening to a separate self, but as a continuous process in which the idea of a separate center becomes increasingly irrelevant. A crucial aspect of Aghora is its relationship with fear. Fear, in the Aghoric understanding, does not originate from external objects or situations. It originates from identification. When awareness is attached to a fixed sense of self, anything that threatens that self produces fear. As awareness becomes less identified, fear loses its psychological foundation. This does not mean that danger is ignored or that pain is denied. It means that fear is no longer amplified by imagination, memory, and anticipation. This explains why environments associated with decay and death play such an important role in Aghora. These environments continuously undermine identification. They offer no support to the idea of permanence. In such places, the mind cannot easily maintain its usual narratives about progress, success, or personal importance. Over time, repeated exposure to this reality erodes the emotional investment in identity. What remains is a form of attention that is steady, alert, and unreactive. Aghora is often misunderstood as an embrace of negativity, but this interpretation arises from a misunderstanding of neutrality. Aghora does not favor suffering, darkness, or transgression. It simply refuses to privilege one aspect of reality over another. From this perspective, life and death are not opposites, but complementary phases of the same process. Pleasure and pain are not enemies, but sensations with different qualities. When this understanding is not theoretical but experiential, resistance diminishes. Another defining characteristic of Aghora is the absence of spiritual ambition. In many spiritual traditions, progress is measured through experiences, states, or moral achievements. Aghora dismantles the very framework that allows progress to be measured. There is no endpoint to reach because there is no fixed entity moving toward it. This does not result in stagnation, it results in immediacy. Each moment is complete in itself, without reference to what should come next. The body within this framework is approached with clarity rather than attachment. Physical sensations are neither exaggerated nor suppressed. Hunger, fatigue, pain, and pleasure are observed as processes rather than interpreted as personal events. This shift has profound psychological consequences. When sensations are no longer personalized, suffering decreases, even if discomfort remains. This distinction is central to understanding Aghora and is often overlooked by those who focus only on external appearances. Death occupies a similar position. In Aghora, death is not romanticized or feared excessively. It is understood as the natural conclusion of a biological process. What gives death its emotional weight is the belief in a permanent self that must be protected. As this belief weakens, fear loses its psychological foundation. This does not mean that danger is ignored or that pain is denied. It means that fear is no longer amplified by imagination, memory, and anticipation. Aghora also involves a fundamental shift in how morality is experienced. Moral codes are recognized as social tools rather than universal laws. This recognition does not produce recklessness. Instead, it produces responsibility rooted in perception rather than obedience. Actions arise from seeing clearly rather than following rules. This is one of the reasons Aghora is difficult to communicate and often misunderstood. A society based on rules struggles to comprehend a state based on awareness. What ultimately distinguishes Aghora from other approaches is its completeness. Nothing is excluded from awareness. No part of reality is labeled unacceptable. This inclusivity is not indulgent, it is demanding. To include everything requires tremendous psychological stability. Most people rely on exclusion to maintain balance. Aghora removes this support and replaces it with clarity.
Over time, as awareness remains steady, the sense of being a separate individual weakens further. Thoughts still arise, but they are no longer automatically believed. Emotions still occur, but they are no longer taken as definitions of self. Memory and anticipation lose their authority. What remains is a form of presence that is simple, direct, and unadorned. This presence is what Aghora really is. Not an ideology, not a practice, not a lifestyle, but a condition in which reality is met without distortion. It is the state in which nothing needs to be added and nothing needs to be removed. It does not promise happiness, enlightenment, or salvation. It offers accuracy. And accuracy, when sustained, transforms perception completely. This is why Aghora has always existed at the margins. It does not integrate easily into systems, institutions, or narratives. It cannot be simplified without being distorted. It can only be lived,
and even then, it leaves little behind to describe. So when we ask what Aghora really is, the most honest answer is this. Aghora is awareness standing alone, without support, without justification, and without escape. It is reality encountered directly before thought divides it, before fear edits it, and before identity claims it. That is Aghora. To go further into what Aghora really is, it becomes necessary to look closely at how awareness normally functions in an ordinary human life. In most people, awareness is fragmented. It jumps from thought to thought, from memory to anticipation, from fear to desire, rarely staying with what is actually present. This fragmentation feels normal because it has been reinforced since childhood, but it is not natural. Aghora is the gradual ending of this fragmentation, not through force or control, but through uninterrupted observation. In Aghora, attention is not trained to concentrate on a single object in order to achieve a special state. Instead, attention becomes inclusive. Everything that arises, thoughts, sensations, emotions, external events, is allowed to appear and disappear without interference. Over time, this creates a fundamental shift. Awareness no longer feels like something a person is doing. It begins to feel like something that is simply happening on its own. This shift is crucial for understanding Aghora, because Aghora is not about cultivating a new identity, such as a spiritual person or a realized being. On the contrary, it is about allowing all identities to dissolve without replacement. When awareness functions without identity, experience becomes direct. There is no intermediary narrating, judging, or interpreting every moment. Life is encountered as it is, not as it is remembered or anticipated. Aghora also involves a radical reorientation toward discomfort. In ordinary life, discomfort is treated as a problem to be solved or eliminated. In Aghora, discomfort is treated as information. Physical pain, emotional unease, and psychological resistance are not immediately acted upon or avoided. They are observed carefully, without adding a personal story to them. Through this observation, it becomes clear that much of what is labeled as suffering is actually resistance layered on top of sensation. This does not mean that Aghora promotes suffering or glorifies hardship. It simply refuses to add unnecessary psychological reactions. When resistance drops, discomfort loses much of its intensity. What remains is sensation without interpretation. This distinction is subtle but transformative, and it is one of the reasons Aghora is so difficult to communicate through language alone. Another essential aspect of Aghora is its relationship with time. Ordinary perception is deeply entangled with past and future. Memories shape identity, and anticipation fuels desire and fear. In Aghora, awareness gradually disengages from this temporal fixation. The past is seen as memory rather than identity, and the future is seen as imagination rather than certainty. As this disengagement deepens, the present moment no longer is a bridge between what was and what will be. It becomes complete in itself. This completeness does not produce excitement or ecstasy. It produces stillness. A stillness that is alert, responsive, and precise. In this stillness, actions arise naturally when needed and cease when they are no longer required. There is no sense of accumulation, no need to preserve experiences or insights. Everything passes, and awareness remains unchanged by what passes through it. Aghora also alters the way meaning is experienced. Most people search for meaning in narratives, personal stories, spiritual explanations, or moral frameworks. Aghora reveals that meaning is not something added to life, it is something projected onto it. When projection stops, life does not become meaningless, it becomes factual. Events no longer need justification, they simply occur, and awareness meets them without demand. This factuality is often mistaken for coldness or detachment, but it is neither. It is intimacy without sentimentality. When there is no need to protect an image of self, perception becomes more sensitive, not less. Sounds, textures, movements, and expressions are noticed with greater clarity because attention is no longer consumed by internal commentary. In this state, relationships also change. Interactions are no longer driven by the need for validation, control, or identity reinforcement. Responses arise from the situation itself rather than from psychological habit. This does not make relationships dramatic or ideal. It makes them simple. Expectations diminish, and with them, conflict loses much of its emotional charge.
Aghora's approach to knowledge is equally uncompromising. Knowledge is not rejected, but it is never confused with truth. Concepts are understood as tools, useful within limited contexts, but incapable of capturing reality itself. This understanding prevents attachment to belief systems, even spiritual ones. When beliefs are seen as provisional, the mind remains flexible and responsive. Over long periods of sustained awareness, another shift occurs. The sense of being the doer of actions weakens. Actions still happen, decisions are still made, but they are no longer claimed as personal achievements. This does not lead to passivity, it leads to efficiency. When action is not burdened by self-importance, it becomes precise and timely. This state is often described inaccurately as detachment from life. In reality, it is detachment from illusion. Life continues with all its unpredictability, but it is no longer filtered through fear-based interpretation. Pleasure is enjoyed without clinging. Pain is endured without resistance. Success and failure lose their exaggerated significance. What remains constant through all of this is awareness itself. Not awareness as a practice, not awareness as a technique, but awareness as the fundamental condition in which experience occurs. Aghora is the recognition of this condition and the refusal to abandon it for psychological comfort. This recognition is not sudden for most. It unfolds gradually through repeated confrontation with reality as it is. There are no dramatic breakthroughs, no final declarations. The process is quiet, often invisible from the outside. This is why Aghora leaves so little trace and so few records. It does not produce teachers eager to explain themselves or followers eager to repeat what they have heard. In the end, when one asks again what Aghora really is, the answer becomes even simpler than before. Aghora is not a path towards something else. It is the end of moving away. It is awareness that does not retreat, does not select, and does not protect identity. It is reality met without negotiation. And this is why Aghora remains one of the most demanding orientations toward existence imaginable. Not because it requires extreme acts, but because it requires something far more difficult, the willingness to remain fully present without escape, without interpretation, and without the promise of reward. That, and nothing less, is what Aghora really is. As this understanding deepens, something subtle but irreversible begins to happen. The mind, which has survived its entire life by movement, explanation, and avoidance, slowly realizes that none of its strategies are effective here. There is nothing left to improve, nothing left to escape into, and nothing left to resolve. Awareness remains, not as an achievement, but as a condition that no longer depends on effort. And this is where Aghora becomes truly difficult, because this is the point where even the idea of spirituality loses relevance. At this stage, there is no longer any fascination with darkness or light, life or death, meaning or meaninglessness. These distinctions feel distant, almost childish, because they belong to a mind that still needs orientation. In Aghora, orientation itself collapses. There is no longer a sense of standing somewhere and moving towards something else. There is only what is happening exactly as it is, without commentary. This absence of commentary is not peaceful in the way people imagine peace. It is stark, it is clean, it leaves no emotional residue. What unsettles most people here is not fear, but emptiness. Not emptiness as despair, but emptiness as the absence of psychological noise. There is no inner voice confirming that things are okay, no reassurance that this state is correct, no identity left to feel safe or unsafe. Awareness stands alone,
unsupported by belief, unsupported by hope, unsupported by meaning, and yet nothing is missing. This is the point where most turn back, not because something is wrong, but because there is nothing left to hold on to. The mind has always survived by attachment to suffering, to joy, to purpose, to struggle. Aghora removes attachment without replacing it with something better. It leaves perception naked. For those who cannot tolerate this nakedness, the return to identity feels like relief. For those who remain, something irreversible occurs. The mind never fully regains its authority. From here on, life continues, but it is no longer personal in the way it once was. Events happen, decisions occur, the body ages, relationships change, death approaches, but none of these are experienced as threats to something central, because there is no longer a center to defend. This is not detachment from life, it is the end of psychological ownership of life. This is why Aghora cannot be explained as a goal or a state to be achieved. It does not elevate a person, it erases the internal structure that needed elevation. There is no pride here, no declaration of realization, no impulse to teach or convert. Silence is not maintained as a discipline, it is simply what remains when there is nothing left to assert. And this is the final misunderstanding people have about Aghora. They assume it leads somewhere. In truth, it leads nowhere. It ends the habit of leading. It is the collapse of the constant internal movement that demanded answers, progress, and reassurance. When that movement ends, awareness does not expand dramatically. It stabilizes. It becomes ordinary. And that ordinariness is what makes it so absolute. Aghora does not stand against the world, it stands before it, without interpretation. It does not reject society, morality, or meaning, it simply does not depend on them.
Because of that, it cannot be threatened by their loss. When everything that can be taken away has already been released, nothing remains vulnerable. So when the question is asked one last time, what Aghora really is, the answer is not something that can be spoken clearly without distortion, but it can be pointed to, quietly. Aghora is awareness that has stopped negotiating with existence. It is perception that no longer needs permission. It is the end of escape, not into darkness, but into reality exactly as it is. And once this is seen, there is no dramatic ending, no closing statement, no sense of completion. Life continues, but the one who needed it to mean something has quietly disappeared. That silence is not an absence. That silence is Aghora. And now, there is nothing left to understand. No conclusion waiting, no meaning forming, no voice inside explaining what this was about. Just this moment, uninterrupted, unprotected. The mind looks for something to hold on to and finds nothing. No belief, no fear, no comfort, not even resistance. Only awareness, standing where escape used to be. Life continues. Breath continues. Sound continues. But the one who needed answers is no longer here. No ending music, no final thought. Just silence that does not ask to be filled.